The moment still burns in my memory. I was sipping my morning coffee when I opened Facebook, expecting the usual chatter of neighbors and old friends. Instead, a photograph filled the screen. My son, in a black suit, standing at the altar, his arm wrapped around a bride in a white dress. My heart stumbled. He was married, and I had not known, not been invited, not even been told. Beneath the photo, his new wife had written, "Only important people were invited." My breath caught in my chest. Important people. And I, his mother, was not one of them. My name is Gloria Harris. I am 71 years old, and this is the story of how my own child erased me from his life, how his wife turned me into nothing more than a bank account, and how they went so far as to try to strip me of my freedom. But it is also the story of how I rose again, protecting myself, finding a new family in unexpected places, and reclaiming my dignity. What I didn't know, staring at those photos that morning, was that this humiliation was only the beginning. The cruelty would grow sharper, more dangerous, until I was forced to fight for the very right to live on my own terms. Her words sat there, glowing on the screen, louder than any shout. Only important people were invited. I read them again and again, as if my eyes might be deceiving me, as if the letters might rearrange themselves into something kinder, something that didn't slice through me like a blade. But no, the sentence stayed the same. It wasn't a mistake. It was deliberate, a public declaration that I was not important in my own son's life. I felt my chest tighten and my hands trembled around the phone. The world seemed to tilt. A neighbor's dog barked outside. A car horn blared down the street, but around me, silence pressed in. It was the silence of humiliation, the kind that echoes inside your bones. For days afterward, that sentence followed me everywhere. When I boiled water for tea, when I folded laundry, when I tried to sleep. Only important people. The words grew heavier in my mind each time I replayed them. They weren't careless. They weren't clumsy. They were cruel. They were a wall, built to keep me out. I kept asking myself, when did I stop being important to my son? I thought of the afternoons when I would sit in the bleachers of his school games, cheering until my voice cracked while other parents didn't bother to show up. I thought of the nights I worked late at the grocery store, pushing carts under flickering lights, aching from head to toe, so that he could have shoes without holes and a future without limits. I thought of the mornings I held his hand as he cried over bullies at school, promising him he would never face the world alone. And yet, here I was. Alone. The betrayal didn't come only from my daughter-in-law's sentence, but from my son's silence. Not a call, not a message, not even a flimsy excuse. Just nothing. He let her words hang in the air like a verdict. He let me sit in my little house, staring at a screen, discovering his wedding the way strangers did. That silence was a choice, and it told me more than words ever could. Still, I tried to rationalize it. Maybe he was embarrassed. Maybe he thought I would disapprove. Maybe he felt torn between two worlds. Mothers are experts at giving their children excuses, at softening their faults with layers of love. But each time I returned to that caption, the excuses dissolved. Because no embarrassment, no awkwardness, no misunderstanding could justify those words. They had been written to wound, to diminish, to erase. I began to notice the small details in the photos. The hall looked expensive, decorated with white roses and gold accents. The guests were dressed in their best, raising glasses of champagne, smiling for the camera. I zoomed in on faces I didn't recognize, colleagues, friends from her side of the family, distant acquaintances. They were important. People who hadn't wiped his tears as a child, people who hadn't sacrificed sleep and comfort for him. They were important, and I was not. I remember putting the phone down and walking to the kitchen sink. My reflection in the window startled me. My face looked older than I remembered, my shoulders bent as though the words themselves had weight. For the first time, I felt invisible in my own life. Not because age had dimmed me, but because my own child had chosen to erase me. That night, I sat at the dining table, staring at the framed photo of him on his graduation day. His cap slightly tilted, his smile wide, his eyes searching for me in the crowd as if I were the anchor of his world. And I was. Back then. I whispered into the stillness, "What happened to you, my boy?" The picture didn't answer. The pain of that caption began to shift into something sharper, a warning. I thought back to the first time I met his bride. She had been polite, even affectionate, but there was something in her eyes, something calculating, something that measured every word I spoke, every gesture I made. At the time, I convinced myself I was imagining it. I wanted to believe in her, for his sake. But now, the puzzle pieces clicked together. This exclusion wasn't an accident. It was a strategy. I went to bed that night, but couldn't sleep. I lay awake staring at the ceiling, while the sentence repeated in my mind. Only important people were invited. It was more than a caption. It was a declaration of war, silent but deliberate. And deep down, I knew this was only the beginning. The silence from my son was louder than any argument. Days turned into a week, and not a single word came from him. No phone call, no text message, not even a hollow apology that might have soothed my aching heart. I tried to convince myself that maybe he was busy, maybe he was adjusting to married life. But even as I whispered those excuses into the empty rooms of my house, I knew the truth. Silence is a choice. And my son had chosen it. Each morning, I checked my phone with a mixture of hope and dread. Hope that his name would finally appear on the screen. Dread that it wouldn't. Each day ended the same, with me staring at nothing, my heart sinking deeper into a pool of rejection. I remembered when silence used to mean something else between us. When he was little, he would sit next to me on the couch, wrapped in a blanket, watching cartoons with wide, curious eyes. He didn't need to speak. His tiny hand resting in mine was enough. Our silences were once full of warmth, of comfort, of connection. Now this silence was a wall, a silence that told me I wasn't worth even the effort of explanation. The pain made me restless. I began to pace the house at night, wandering from room to room like a ghost. I lingered in his old bedroom, still painted the soft blue he had chosen as a teenager. The posters on the wall had faded, the trophies gathered dust, but the room still held traces of the boy he used to be. I sat on his bed and whispered, "Do you remember me? Do you remember who I was to you?" The walls answered with emptiness. Sometimes anger flared up inside me, hot and sharp. I thought of calling him, demanding answers, screaming into the phone until he couldn't ignore me anymore. But then I remembered the caption, those deliberate words written by his wife, and I realized he hadn't fought them. He had let them stand. He had let me be erased. What could he possibly say now that would undo that betrayal? And then came the guilt, the cruel companion of every mother. Was I too strict when he was young? Did I give too much or too little? Did my sacrifices become chains that he resented? I replayed every moment of our shared history, searching for cracks I might have missed. But no matter how hard I looked, I couldn't find an answer that justified his silence. One evening, after another day of waiting for a call that never came, I sat down with my journal. I had started writing in it after my husband died, using it to pour out the words I couldn't say aloud. That night, I wrote, "I am invisible to him. I raised a man who can erase his own mother." Seeing those words in ink broke something inside me, because once written, they felt undeniable. The following Sunday, I dressed in my best sweater and went to church. Not for the sermon, not for prayer, but because I needed to sit among people, to hear voices around me, to remind myself that I still existed. A kind woman from the choir sat beside me and held my hand. She didn't know what had happened, but she saw the heaviness in my eyes. That simple gesture nearly unraveled me, because in that moment, I realized just how much I was starving for recognition, for someone to see me. But my son's silence persisted, and with each passing day, the truth became clearer. He wasn't going to reach out. Not on his own. I was no longer part of his new life, and silence was his way of telling me so. I thought the wedding photos were the wound, but they weren't. The real wound was this absence, this emptiness where my son used to be. That absence pressed on me like a weight I couldn't shake. And somewhere deep down, a whisper grew louder. If you matter to him at all, you'll have to find out the hard way. It was a Tuesday afternoon when my phone finally lit up with a message. For a split second, relief rushed through me. My son had reached out. Maybe at last he was ready to explain, to apologize, to tell me that leaving me out of his wedding had been a mistake. My fingers shook as I opened the message. But it wasn't from him. It was from her. My new daughter-in-law. The words were short, clipped, almost businesslike. "We're behind on bills this month. Could you send some money to help us catch up?" No greeting, no warmth, not even a polite "how are you?" Just a request. No, a demand, really. I stared at the screen in disbelief. Not a word about the wedding, not a word about the caption that cut me to pieces. No acknowledgement of the pain they had caused. Nothing. Only money. I sank into my chair, my heart hammering. My mind ran back through years of sacrifices. The extra shifts I had taken at the store. The nights I had come home too tired to eat, only to see my boy asleep, his face lit softly by the lamp I left on for him. I had done it all willingly, with love, without ever expecting repayment. But gratitude? Was that too much to ask for? The request replayed in my mind like a bitter echo. Send money, not "we miss you," not "we're sorry." Only send money. I could almost hear her voice, cold and calculated, shaping my role. I wasn't a mother-in-law. I wasn't even a mother. I was a bank, a mother ATM, a dispenser of cash, expected to give without question and without end. I thought about calling my son directly, asking him if this was really what he wanted. But a heavier thought stopped me. If he hadn't reached out by now, then he had allowed her to speak for both of them. His silence wasn't protection anymore. It was complicity. That night, I walked through the house with a new kind of restlessness. The walls felt closer, the rooms colder. I opened drawers and pulled out old letters he had written me as a teenager, quick scribbles of "thanks, Mom" and "love you forever." I clutched them to my chest and wondered how those sweet words had turned into this barren silence, this transactional relationship where love had been replaced with invoices. Sleep didn't come easily. When I closed my eyes, I saw that message glowing against the dark. Send some money to help us catch up. And beneath it, the unspoken message, clearer than any words. You don't matter unless you pay. I tried to rationalize again. Maybe they were struggling. Maybe the wedding had drained them. Maybe it wasn't malice, just desperation. Mothers are skilled at finding excuses for their children, at patching over wounds with layers of hope. But this time, the excuses tasted like ashes in my mouth. Because no matter how I turned it over in my mind, I couldn't ignore the truth. They hadn't wanted me at the wedding, but they wanted my money afterward. The insult of it cut deeper than the exclusion itself. It was one thing to erase me from their celebration. It was another to treat me as a lifeline only when convenient, as though my existence mattered only in the form of deposits and transfers. I sat in the dark until dawn, listening to the quiet creaks of the house, the distant hum of traffic outside. And in that stillness, I made a promise to myself. I didn't speak it aloud, not yet, but it began to form like a seed in my chest. I would not let myself be used. Not this time. The message from her might have looked like a simple request for money, but I knew better. It was the first tug at a rope they meant to tighten around me. And if I gave in, if I sent money without question, I would be stepping into a trap that could swallow me whole. I put the phone face down on the table and whispered into the empty room. No. It was a small word, but it felt like the beginning of something larger. The first stone laid in a path that would either save me or break me. Memories came flooding back after that message. Memories I had tried to bury, but that rose up, raw and demanding. I thought of the endless hours I had worked when my son was young, the sacrifices that shaped every corner of our lives. My late husband had passed when our boy was only 7, leaving me to carry the weight of 2 parents on shoulders that often felt too fragile. Yet I did it, because love is stronger than exhaustion. I remembered coming home after double shifts, peeling off my shoes to find my feet swollen, my back aching, my hands raw from stocking shelves. He would be at the table, his homework spread out in front of him, eyes lighting up when I walked through the door. "You're home," he'd say, as if my presence alone made the world safe again. There were winters when the heater broke, and instead of calling a repairman, I stacked blankets and pulled him close, whispering stories to keep his mind off the cold. There were summers when bills piled high, and I skipped meals so he could eat enough to keep growing strong. I did it all without resentment, because I believed that one day he would stand tall on the foundation I had built, and he would remember the love poured into every sacrifice. When he grew older, I was the one who scraped together money for his college tuition. I still remember signing the check with hands that shook, praying it wouldn't bounce, praying the bank wouldn't reject it. Later, when he struggled to find work, it was me who slipped extra cash into his pocket, whispering, "Don't worry, you'll find your way." And when he bought his first car, it was my credit that secured the loan, my steady payments that made sure he could drive without fear of repossession. Every milestone in his life was etched with my sacrifices. And yet, as I sat there staring at that cold, transactional message from his wife, it felt like none of it had mattered. All the sleepless nights, all the missed meals, all the quiet tears, erased, reduced to nothing more than proof that I could still provide. The bitterness burned inside me, not because I wanted gratitude handed to me like a medal, but because I had hoped, deep down, that my son understood the depth of what I had given, that he would never allow anyone to diminish me, that he would never stay silent in the face of cruelty directed at his own mother. Instead, I was confronted with a harsh truth. He had grown comfortable with the idea that I was his safety net, his constant rescuer, the bank that never closed. Somewhere along the way, my love had been mistaken for obligation, my sacrifices seen not as gifts, but as debts I owed indefinitely. The caption on the wedding photo and the message asking for money were not isolated events. Together, they revealed a story I had been too afraid to read. I was no longer a mother in his eyes. I was a resource, a convenience. And in the hands of his new wife, that perception would only deepen, sharpen, and be wielded against me. That night, I pulled out an old photo album, one I hadn't opened in years. Page after page of my son's life lay before me. His first steps, his gap-toothed smile, his high school graduation. My tears blurred the images, but I kept turning the pages, searching for the boy I remembered, the boy who once looked at me as though I was his entire world. I clung to that memory because it hurt too much to accept the man he had become. Yet somewhere between the grief and the bitterness, a realization began to bloom. I could no longer afford to cling to what was. I had to see clearly what was unfolding now. And what was unfolding was dangerous, because this wasn't just about money. This was about control. And if I didn't act soon, the life I had built, the independence I had fought for, could be stripped away piece by piece, until there was nothing left of me but the role they had written for me. Provider, silent, erased. I should have trusted my instincts from the beginning. The first time I met her, my son's future wife, I remember watching her smile at me across the dinner table. It was a beautiful smile, polite, perfectly placed, but there was something in her eyes that unsettled me. They weren't warm, not truly. They were sharp, calculating, as though every word I spoke was being weighed, every movement assessed. At the time, I brushed it aside. I told myself I was being unfair, that maybe grief from losing my husband had made me overly protective of my son. I wanted to believe she loved him, that she would cherish him as much as I had. After all, wasn't that every mother's hope? To see her child loved and cared for? But as the months passed, little things began to pile up. Invitations that mysteriously never reached me. Conversations where she spoke for him, answering questions directed at him as if she had rehearsed his responses. Subtle remarks about my age, my habits, my old-fashioned ways. At first, I laughed them off, but each comment carried a sting. Then there was the money. Always the money. It started small, a forgotten lunch bill, a request for gas money when they came to visit. But the requests grew bolder, wrapped in excuses that sounded rehearsed. My son would look at me with tired eyes, mumbling, "It's just this once, Mom." And I, blinded by love, opened my purse again and again. Looking back, I see how the pattern formed. She played the role of the sweet partner while slowly tightening her grip on him and on me. My son, once independent and strong-willed, seemed to shrink in her presence, his voice growing quieter each time she spoke for both of them. The boy who used to confide in me about everything now avoided my gaze, as if ashamed. I began to notice how he echoed her words. If I suggested dinner together, he'd say, "We're too busy." If I mentioned missing him, he'd reply, "You're overreacting." Phrases that didn't sound like him, phrases that had her fingerprints all over them. The wedding caption confirmed what I had long feared. She didn't just want distance between us. She wanted me erased. My role as mother was being rewritten into something hollow, transactional. She wanted my son's loyalty, his love, his dependence, all for herself. And she wanted my resources, my years of sacrifice, bent to serve her ambitions. I lay awake at night replaying our encounters, every smile that hadn't reached her eyes, every calculated pause in conversation. My instincts had been screaming the truth all along, and I had silenced them in the name of peace. Now the cost of that silence was clear. What terrified me most was not her cunning, but my son's compliance. He had chosen her side, whether consciously or not. He had let her words wound me, let her demands define me, let her control shape our relationship. I didn't know if he realized what he was surrendering, or if he simply didn't care. That realization hollowed me out. Because as much as I wanted to believe he was trapped, manipulated, or blinded by love, I also had to face the possibility that he was comfortable with this arrangement. That part of him liked the convenience of a wife who managed everything, even his mother. That part of him had stopped seeing me as a person and started seeing me as a function. I found myself standing in front of the mirror one evening, staring at my own reflection. I searched my face for answers, the lines carved by years of work, the softness that remained from a lifetime of caring. Who was I now? To them, I was nobody. An invisible woman with a bank account, a mother ATM. I pressed my hands against the counter, steadying myself, and whispered, "No more." The words sounded fragile at first, but they grew firmer each time I repeated them. No more. Because I understood something essential in that moment. If I didn't draw a line, if I didn't step out of this trap, I would lose not only my money, but my dignity, my very self. The mask had fallen. I could see her clearly now, and I could see the danger in pretending that this was only about hurt feelings. No, this was about control, and I would not allow myself to be controlled. The message asking for money sat unanswered on my phone for days. Each time I looked at it, my chest tightened, but a new determination began to stir inside me. I had always been the one to give, to provide, to say yes. But something about that caption, "Only important people," followed so closely by the demand for money, broke something inside me. It wasn't just about money anymore, it was about respect, and I had none in their eyes. One morning, I walked to my desk and pulled out the folder where I kept my financial papers. Bank statements, property deeds, insurance policies, all the little pieces of my life that represented decades of hard work. I spread them out across the table and stared at them, feeling both vulnerable and powerful. Vulnerable because I realized how much I had left exposed. Powerful because I knew it wasn't too late to protect myself. The first step was simple but decisive. I called my bank. With a firm voice I didn't even know I still had, I asked them to cancel the automatic transfers I had been sending to my son. Money I had convinced myself was help, but that had quietly turned into obligation. The woman on the other end asked politely if I was sure. I closed my eyes, felt the ache in my chest, and said, "Yes, I am sure." When the confirmation came through, a weight lifted from my shoulders. For the first time in years, I felt like I had drawn a line, not with them, but with myself. Next, I made an appointment with a financial advisor, someone recommended by a friend at church. Sitting in that office, explaining my situation, was both humiliating and liberating. I admitted how much I had given, how little I had received in return, and how deeply I feared being manipulated further. The advisor listened carefully and then helped me set up protections, limits on access, new accounts, safeguards to ensure no one could move my money without my consent. Walking out of that office, I felt taller, lighter, steadier. For the first time in a long while, I wasn't just surviving, I was protecting myself. That evening, I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of tea. The house was quiet, but not heavy the way it had been. It was the quiet of boundaries finally being set, of walls being built where doors had been left open for too long. I whispered to myself, "You are not an ATM. You are a woman. You matter." I thought of my son and wondered what his reaction would be when the money stopped flowing. Would he call me? Would he finally speak for himself instead of hiding behind her messages? Or would he let her take the lead, lashing out, accusing me of betrayal? The uncertainty hurt, but not as much as before. Because now I knew, whatever his reaction, I was ready. For years, I had equated love with sacrifice, believing that to give endlessly was proof of my devotion. But love without respect is not love at all. It's exploitation. And I finally understood that if I wanted to preserve any part of myself, I had to stop feeding the cycle. That night, I slept soundly for the first time since the wedding photos appeared on my screen. I still woke once or twice, reaching for my phone out of habit, but each time I reminded myself, the transfers are gone, the chain has been cut. Yet even as I rested in that new peace, a part of me sensed what was coming. People who build their power on control do not accept boundaries quietly. And I knew that my refusal to keep paying would not be the end of the battle. It would be the beginning. But this time, I wasn't afraid. Because I had taken the first step toward reclaiming not just my money, but my dignity. I didn't have to wait long for the retaliation. Within a week, my phone rang. For the first time in months, it was my son's number flashing on the screen. My heart skipped. Some foolish part of me still hoped he might call to apologize, to explain, to bridge the widening canyon between us. But when I answered, his voice was tight, rehearsed, as though he were reading from a script. "Mom," he began, "we noticed you stopped the transfers. We're in a tough spot right now, and it's not fair for you to just pull support without warning." Support. That was the word he used. As though my years of sacrifices had been a contract, as though I owed him for life. Before I could respond, I heard her voice in the background, sharp and unmistakable. She wasn't even trying to stay quiet. "Tell her it's irresponsible. Tell her she's abandoning her own family." My stomach twisted. He lowered his voice, but the words were hers. She says, "It feels like you don't want to be part of our lives anymore." Something inside me snapped. "Part of your lives," I said, my voice trembling with both hurt and anger. "I wasn't even invited to your wedding. I found out like a stranger on the internet, and now the only words I hear from you are about money. Do you hear yourself, son? Do you even recognize what you're saying?" There was silence on the line. A silence so thick it pressed against my ears. Then, finally, his voice came back, brittle, defensive. "We're just trying to build a future. You don't understand how hard it is for us." I laughed bitterly, a sound that surprised even me. "Don't I? Who do you think carried you through your future? Who do you think worked until her body ached so you could have shoes, school, a car, an education? Don't talk to me about hard. I lived hard for you." The line went quiet again, and then I heard it, her voice, no longer in the background, but clear and direct. She had grabbed the phone. "If you won't help us willingly, maybe it's time we make sure your finances are handled by someone who's capable." The word stung like acid. Capable. The implication was sharp, unmistakable, that I wasn't, that I couldn't be trusted with my own life. I felt a cold chill run through me. This wasn't just about money anymore. This was about power, control, domination. And in that moment, I understood the full weight of what I was up against. I hung up the phone, my hands trembling, and sat in silence. Their threat echoed in my mind, growing louder with each passing second. They were preparing to come after me in ways I hadn't imagined. I could have broken down right then, collapsed under the weight of betrayal. But instead, a strange calm settled over me. Because threats are only powerful when you're unprepared. And now, I knew exactly what I needed to do. Protect myself, not only from their hands reaching for my money, but from their plans to strip me of my very autonomy. For the first time, I realized this was no longer just a family conflict. It was a battle for my dignity, my independence, my very right to live on my own terms. And I was not going to lose. The threat lingered in my ears for days. Maybe it's time we make sure your finances are handled by someone who's capable. I knew what it meant even before the paperwork arrived. They weren't going to stop at asking for money. They were going to try to take control of everything: my bank accounts, my house, my independence. It started subtly. A letter came in the mail, full of legal jargon that made my stomach twist. They had spoken to an attorney. They were exploring guardianship, the polite word for declaring me incapable of managing my own life. I read the words 3 times, the letters swimming on the page, my hands trembling so badly I could hardly hold the paper. My own child, my own blood, preparing to strip me of my freedom. The humiliation was almost unbearable. For decades, I had built a life with my bare hands, paid every bill, balanced every budget, protected every dollar. I had worked through exhaustion and grief, kept food on the table, raised my son into adulthood. And now, because I had finally said no, they wanted the world to see me as a frail old woman, unable to think for herself. At night, I sat by the window, the house quiet around me. I thought of my late husband, the way he used to say, "Gloria, you're the strongest woman I've ever known." I whispered into the silence, "Would you believe this if you were here? Would you believe our son would do this to me?" The tears came hot, but beneath them was something else. Anger. Not the fleeting anger of a sharp word or a slammed door, a deep, simmering anger that gave me strength. But I also knew anger alone wouldn't protect me. I needed help. That's when I thought of my dance group. After my husband passed, I had joined a community center class, ballroom, line dancing, even a little salsa. It wasn't just about moving to music, it was about feeling alive again, about remembering that I was more than grief, more than sacrifice. Those women had become my friends, my confidants. If there was any place I could be seen, heard, and believed, it was with them. I walked into class the following week, my body heavy with the weight of the letter, but the music was already playing. They greeted me with hugs, chatter, laughter. For the first time since the nightmare began, I felt a flicker of belonging. When the song ended, one of them, Maria, always the boldest, pulled me aside. "Gloria, something's wrong. I can see it in your eyes. Tell us." The words tumbled out before I could stop them. I told them everything. The wedding I wasn't invited to, the cruel caption, the constant demands for money, and now the threat of interdicting me. By the end, my voice cracked with shame. I expected pity, maybe even disbelief. Instead, they erupted with outrage. "They can't do that," Maria snapped. "Gloria, you're sharper than all of us put together," another said, squeezing my hand. "You need a lawyer of your own," someone else added firmly. Their support wrapped around me like armor. For months, I had been shrinking under the weight of betrayal, doubting myself, wondering if I was the problem. But in their eyes, I wasn't a frail old woman. I was a friend, a fighter, a woman worthy of respect. That night, I went home with a different kind of fire in my chest. I pulled the letter out of the drawer, read it again, and instead of trembling, I whispered, Not this time. They thought they could erase me. They thought they could silence me, control me, strip me of my independence. But they had underestimated me, and they had underestimated the power of women who stand together. The battle wasn't over. In fact, it was only beginning. But for the first time, I didn't feel alone. The day the official summons arrived, I felt my knees weaken. A thick envelope, stamped with the seal of the court, lay heavy in my hands. Inside, in black and white, were the words I had dreaded. My son and his wife were formally petitioning to have me declared incompetent, unable to manage my own affairs. I sat at the kitchen table, staring at the document as though it were a death sentence. My son's name was there, signed neatly under the claims that painted me as confused, forgetful, irresponsible with money. Lies, each one, but lies that could destroy me if the court believed them. My chest ached as though my heart itself were being dragged across the paper. For hours, I didn't move. The hum of the refrigerator, the ticking of the wall clock, the faint sound of children playing outside. The world went on while mine crumbled. It wasn't just betrayal now. It was annihilation. But then I thought of my friends at the dance hall, the way their eyes had burned with indignation when I told them what was happening. Their voices echoed in my memory. "You need a lawyer of your own." So I called Maria. My hands shook as I dialed, but when she answered, I forced myself to say the words. "It's official. They've filed against me." She didn't hesitate. "We're not letting them win, Gloria. We'll find someone to fight this. You're not alone." And she meant it. Within 2 days, I was sitting in an office across from a woman named Angela Ruiz, a lawyer with sharp eyes and a steady voice. She listened without interrupting as I poured out the whole story, my humiliation, my fear, my anger. When I finished, she leaned back and said firmly, "They don't have a case. We're going to fight this, and we're going to win." Hearing those words was like breathing again after being underwater. For the first time since the letter arrived, I felt a flicker of hope. The weeks that followed were exhausting. Angela guided me through paperwork, medical evaluations, witness statements. She reminded me again and again, "They have to prove incapacity, Gloria, and you are anything but incapable." Still, every step of the process felt like walking through fire. To have to prove that I was sane, competent, worthy of handling my own life, it was degrading in a way I can't even fully describe. At night, I lay awake, replaying my son's signature on those papers. How could he have done this? How could the boy who once clung to me in fear of thunderstorms now stand in a courtroom, prepared to argue that I was unfit to live independently? Sometimes I imagined him hesitating, doubting, even regretting. But then I remembered the silence, the way he had let her speak for him, the way he had stood by while I was erased from his wedding. And I knew, whatever doubts he had, they weren't strong enough to bring him back to me. The hearing date loomed closer, a shadow I couldn't escape. But through it all, my dance friends surrounded me like a second family. They drove me to meetings, cooked me meals, even practiced testimony with me so I could stand tall in court. Each time I faltered, they reminded me, "Gloria, you are stronger than they think, stronger than even you know." And slowly, I began to believe it. By the morning of the hearing, I wasn't trembling anymore. I walked into that courthouse with my head high, my lawyer by my side, and my friends filling the benches behind me. I wasn't alone. Not anymore. They thought they could strip me of my dignity. They thought they could declare me unfit. But I was ready to face them, ready to show the judge and my son exactly who I still was. The courthouse smelled faintly of polished wood and dust, a place where lives could be rewritten with the strike of a gavel. I sat at the table beside Angela, my lawyer, hands folded tightly in my lap. Across the aisle, my son sat with his wife, both of them dressed neatly, their attorney flipping through papers with calm precision. My heart twisted at the sight of him. My boy, the same boy I once held against my chest, now sitting as a stranger, preparing to argue that I wasn't capable of living on my own. The judge entered, and we all rose. My knees wobbled, but I held myself steady. This was not just about money. It was about who I was, about whether the years I had spent building my life would be taken from me with a single decision. The proceedings began. Their lawyer spoke first, laying out a picture of me that was unrecognizable. He described a woman who was forgetful, confused, reckless with her finances. He used words like deteriorating and unstable. Each sentence landed like a stone on my chest. My son sat there, expressionless, his wife occasionally whispering in his ear. When it was Angela's turn, she stood tall, her voice cutting through the air with clarity. "Your Honor," she said, "my client is not only competent, she is a woman who has managed her own finances responsibly for decades. What we see here is not concern for her well-being. It is an attempt to control her." She called me to the stand. My legs trembled as I walked forward, but when I sat down, something shifted inside me. I realized this was my chance to speak, to be heard, to reclaim my voice. The opposing lawyer tried to trip me with questions. Did I sometimes forget where I put my keys? Had I ever been late on a bill? Did I feel lonely at times? Each question dripped with condescension, as if normal human flaws were evidence of incapacity. But I answered calmly, steadily, reminding myself of the truth. I was not the woman they painted me to be. Angela then asked me about my life, about the years I had worked, the home I had paid for, the sacrifices I had made to raise my son. As I spoke, my voice grew stronger. I described balancing budgets late into the night, saving every penny to keep us afloat, teaching myself how to repair appliances when money was too tight for a handyman. By the time I finished, the courtroom was quiet. Even the judge leaned forward, listening closely. Then came the hardest moment. Angela asked me directly, "Gloria, why do you believe your son and his wife are pursuing this action against you?" I swallowed hard, my eyes stinging, and turned to look at them. My son avoided my gaze, staring at the table. His wife met my eyes with a cold defiance. "Because I stopped giving them money," I said simply. The truth hung in the air, undeniable, heavy. When I stepped down from the stand, my friends in the gallery smiled encouragingly, some even nodding through tears. Their presence steadied me. I was not alone. The judge took notes, his face unreadable. "We will reconvene tomorrow for closing statements," he announced. The gavel struck, echoing through the room like thunder. As we filed out of the courtroom, I glanced once more at my son. For a split second, I thought I saw something flicker in his eyes. Shame, maybe, or doubt. But then his wife tugged his arm, and just like that, the flicker was gone. That night, as I lay in bed, exhaustion washed over me, but so did a quiet pride. No matter what the verdict would be, I had stood up, spoken my truth, and refused to be erased. Tomorrow, the decision would come, and whatever it was, I knew one thing for certain. I had fought for myself. The next morning, I dressed carefully. A simple navy dress, pearl earrings, and the black shoes I had polished the night before. I wanted the judge to see me as I was, steady, dignified, capable. Not the fragile, confused caricature painted by my son's lawyer. The courtroom felt colder that day. The air hummed with tension as we took our seats. My friends were in the gallery again, their presence a quiet wall of strength behind me. Angela leaned close and whispered, "You've already won in their eyes, Gloria. Now let's make sure the court sees it too." Closing arguments began. Their lawyer stood, his voice smooth, almost rehearsed. He repeated the claims of my supposed decline: forgetfulness, poor decision-making, vulnerability. He framed their actions as concern, not greed. "This is not about control," he insisted. "This is about ensuring Mrs. Harris is cared for in her later years." I clenched my hands together in my lap. Cared for. As though I were a child. As though I hadn't managed a household, a career, and a family through storms most people couldn't imagine. Then Angela rose. Her voice carried through the room with quiet authority. "Your Honor, what we see here is not a case of protection. It is a case of exploitation. My client has managed her own life with strength and precision. The only thing that has changed is that she has finally told her son and his wife the word they do not want to hear, no, and for that, they have decided to punish her." The judge nodded, his pen scratching against the paper. The silence in the room was thick. Finally, it was time for the ruling. My heart pounded as the judge lifted his eyes. "I have reviewed the testimonies, the evidence, and the behavior of all parties involved. It is the decision of this court that Mrs. Gloria Harris remains fully competent to manage her own affairs. The petition for guardianship is hereby denied." The gavel struck once, sharp and final. The words washed over me like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. I exhaled a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. My friends behind me whispered, "Yes," and clapped softly, their joy barely contained. Angela touched my hand and whispered, "It's over. You're free." Across the aisle, I saw my son slump in his chair. His wife's face hardened, her jaw tight with fury. For a fleeting second, I thought he might look at me, might acknowledge what had just happened. But he didn't. He kept his eyes down, letting her lead him out of the courtroom as if nothing had changed. But everything had changed. I walked out of that courthouse taller than I had walked in. The air felt different on my skin, crisp and alive. For months, I had been drowning under their control, their silence, their manipulation. And now I had surfaced. I was still me, independent, capable, whole. That night, as I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of tea, I didn't cry. For once, I didn't cry. I let the silence of the house surround me, not as emptiness, but as peace. I whispered into the quiet, "You did it, Gloria. You stood your ground. The battle was over, but the war inside me, the grief, the betrayal, the broken bond with my son, would take longer to heal. Yet for the first time in a long while, I believed I could heal. Because no one, not even my own child, could take away what I had reclaimed that day, my freedom and my dignity." In the weeks after the ruling, I felt the air in my lungs differently. Each breath seemed fuller, as if a weight I had carried for too long had finally been lifted. The court had spoken. I was competent. I was free. But freedom, I soon realized, came with a bittersweet taste. My phone stayed silent. No apology from my son, no attempt to mend what had been broken. The only sound was the echo of his silence. That same silence that had begun the unraveling months before. Part of me still hoped he might call, even just to say, "I'm sorry, Mom." But deep down, I knew he wouldn't. He had made his choice, and so had I. One evening, I sat by the fireplace with my photo albums spread out across the table. Page after page, his life stared back at me. First steps, school plays, birthday candles blown out with cheeks puffed. I traced his face with my fingertip, the boy who once clung to me during storms, who once whispered that he'd take care of me when I grew old. That boy was gone, replaced by a man I barely recognized. And yet, even in my grief, a new strength anchored me. The court's decision had done more than protect my finances. It had reminded me of who I was. Not a fragile woman to be managed, not a mother ATM to be drained, but Gloria Harris, a woman who had survived widowhood, who had raised a son alone, who had carried herself through storms most couldn't endure. I began to see my life in a new light. For years, I had poured everything into being a mother, into giving without limit. But now I asked myself, what about me? What about the life I've always wanted? So I started small. I redecorated the living room, painting the walls a soft green that reminded me of spring. I treated myself to new sheets, crisp and white, the kind I had always thought were too much of a luxury. And I returned to the dance hall with more energy than ever. The music filled me in ways that words couldn't. Each step, each twirl, each laugh with my friends felt like a reclamation of joy. It was during one of those evenings that the idea took root. As the band played and my friends spun and clapped around me, I thought, why am I still holding on to this house, this car, these things that weigh me down. My son didn't want my home, not truly. What he wanted was control. But control could only reach me if I clung to what they believed was power. A few weeks later, I put the house on the market, the car too. At first, the thought scared me. This had been my sanctuary, my place of memories. But as I boxed up photos and folded away linens, I realized something profound. The house held the past, but I was walking into the future. When the sales were complete, I divided the money. Some I kept for myself, secure and untouchable. But a portion, a generous portion, I donated to organizations dedicated to protecting seniors from financial abuse. I wanted my pain to mean something. I wanted my story to help others find their strength before it was too late. For the first time in years, I wasn't living for someone else's approval or waiting for a call that never came. I was living for me. The betrayal still cut deep, yes. The wound of my son's absence would never fully close. But as I packed a small suitcase for my first trip with my dance friends, a weekend competition out of state, I caught my reflection in the mirror. My eyes were alive again. My smile reached all the way to my heart. And in that moment, I knew. I had lost my son to greed and manipulation, but I had found myself again. The months that followed felt like a second spring, a season of renewal I hadn't dared to imagine. Once the dust of the court battle settled, I realized how much space had opened in my life, space that used to be consumed by fear, by silence, by the constant weight of giving too much. Selling the house was the most difficult step. That home had carried decades of memories, the laughter of birthday parties, the echoes of my husband's voice, the quiet hum of nights spent helping my son with homework. Each room was stitched with the fabric of my past. But when the movers carried out the last box, I stood in the empty living room, sunlight streaming across bare floors, and instead of grief, I felt relief. The house was no longer a prison of expectations. It was simply a chapter I had closed. The car went next. A sleek sedan that had once been my pride, but now felt like a weight I didn't need. Releasing it meant more freedom than loss. I was no longer tied to maintaining symbols of stability that only served to make me a target for those who wanted control. With the money secured, I did something I had never done before. I gave a portion away. I sat down with Angela, my lawyer, and asked her to help me donate to organizations that protect seniors from abuse and exploitation. Signing those checks felt like a small act of justice, not just for me, but for others who might not yet realize the danger they were in. My pain became a warning, my strength a shield for others. The rest of the money I kept for myself, safely guarded. But this time, it wasn't to be hoarded or hidden. It was to be used, to be lived. I booked my first trip with my dance friends, a competition in Chicago. When I boarded the bus with them, laughter filling the air, I realized how long it had been since I'd felt part of something joyful. We danced until our feet ached, cheered each other on, and when the judges announced our group had placed third, we screamed like children. I hadn't felt that alive in years. More trips followed, small ones at first. A weekend by the lake, a day spent exploring a museum, late nights sharing stories in hotel rooms. Each moment felt like reclaiming pieces of myself I had forgotten existed. I was no longer just surviving betrayal. I was living beyond it. Sometimes, when the music swelled and I spun across the floor, I would catch myself smiling so wide it startled me. Not because I had forgotten the pain, but because I had learned it no longer defined me. And in quiet moments, I thought of my son, not with the same sharp grief as before, but with a softer sorrow. I accepted that he had chosen his path, just as I had chosen mine. I could not change his silence, his betrayal, or his wife's manipulations, but I could refuse to let them cage me. By letting go of the house, the car, the endless giving, I had let go of the chains they tried to wrap around me. I had reclaimed something far greater, my dignity, my freedom, my joy. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was living, fully, fiercely, and on my own terms. Freedom, I discovered, is not just about what you escape from. It's about what you run toward. And for the first time in years, I was running toward life. I traveled with my dance friends to cities I had only ever seen in photographs. We entered competitions, laughing at ourselves when we forgot steps, cheering wildly when one of us managed to spin just right. In those hotel ballrooms, under the swirl of lights and the pulse of music, I felt years melt off my shoulders. I wasn't just Gloria Harris, 71 widow, mother ATM discarded by her son. I was Gloria Harris, woman, dancer, friend, alive. There was a night in New Orleans I will never forget. We had spent the day exploring the French Quarter, the air thick with jazz and spice, and that evening we joined a local dance gathering. I let the music carry me, my feet moving with abandon, my laughter spilling into the crowd. For the first time since my husband's death, I wasn't weighed down by grief or betrayal. I was simply here, present, free. Back in my hotel room later, I sat by the window, looking out over the city lights. A thought came to me, gentle but steady. This is what life was always meant to feel like, not waiting for a call that would never come, not shrinking under someone else's judgment, not being defined by what was taken from me, but creating, choosing, claiming joy. The betrayal of my son still lingered. Some nights, I dreamed of him as a child, and I woke with tears on my cheeks. But those tears no longer broke me. They reminded me that I had loved deeply, that I had given everything I could, and that sometimes love is not enough to keep someone from choosing another path. His silence was his choice. My freedom was mine. Months later, as I packed for another trip, this time a cross-country tour with my dance group, I glanced at the framed photo of my husband on my dresser. His smile, frozen in time, seemed to shine with pride. I whispered, "I'm doing it, love. I'm living again." And I was. I had faced exclusion, humiliation, manipulation, and even the threat of losing my independence. But I had fought back. I had stood in court and reclaimed my dignity. I had torn away the chains of financial control. And in their place, I had built a life of laughter, travel, music, and friendship. My son may never return to me. My daughter-in-law may never regret what she tried to take. But I am not broken. I am not erased. I am alive. And in the glow of that realization, I found something I thought I had lost forever: joy. When I look back now, I see a journey carved out of both pain and resilience. I began as a mother, staring at Facebook photos of a wedding I was not invited to, branded as unimportant by my own child's wife. I was humiliated, silenced, and treated as though my worth was measured only by the money I could give. For a time, I almost believed that lie. But humiliation can be a teacher. The caption that cut me, the silence that followed, the demand for money, all of it forced me to wake up. To ask myself, who am I when I stop giving? Who am I beyond being his mother? The answer came slowly, painfully, through betrayal and through battle. My son and his wife tried to erase me, even to strip me of my right to live freely. But instead of breaking me, they revealed a strength I didn't know I still had. They pushed me to fight, not against age, but against the abuse of being used, manipulated, and discarded. The courtroom became a stage where I declared my worth aloud. And when the judge's words rang out, affirming my capacity, my dignity, I felt something inside me heal. Not the wound of losing my son, but the wound of doubting myself. And beyond the courtroom, I found something more precious: community. Friends who stood beside me, who held my hand, who reminded me that I was not invisible. Together we laughed, we danced, we traveled. They showed me that family is not always bound by blood, but by love, respect, and shared joy. Today, I live on my own terms. I no longer wait by the phone for a call that may never come. I no longer allow money to be the chain that ties me to people who do not value me. Instead, I invest in experiences, in causes that protect others, in moments that make me feel alive. I share my story, not just for myself, but for anyone who has ever felt erased, used, or silenced by those they loved most. You are not an ATM. You are not invisible. You are not defined by the betrayal of others. You are defined by the courage it takes to reclaim yourself. So, I ask you, wherever you are in the world, whatever city or country you're listening from, have you ever had to set boundaries with someone you loved? Have you ever had to choose your own dignity over their approval? Share your story with me in the comments. I promise, your voice matters here. If this story touched you, don't forget to subscribe, leave your thoughts, and if you feel moved, use the super thanks to support more stories like this. And if you'd like, take a look at the other videos on this channel. Stories of courage, betrayal, and renewal. Stories that remind us we are never alone in our struggles. See you in the next life story, with love and respect.